we can get our panel started. We look forward to it. Thank you, everyone, for being here.
And thank you, Kyla. Okay, so this panel discussion is on race and racism in the therapy room, which is a really timely kind of thing for us to be talking about this year with all the things that have been going on. It's not the first time these things have happened, but particularly with the instances of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, and others whose death at the hands of police occurred and has been seen around the country and has resulted in a lot of discussion nationally and really an emergence of a lot of diverse people all around the country who are the majority of the country actually who are trying to do things to they're starting to more and more recognize the need to ally with Black Americans as they contend with racism as it continues in our society. So the discussion we're going to do comes at a really key moment, I think, for us. Now, let me tell you a little bit about how this actually got started. A few months back on our listserv, someone, I forget who, posted an article that involved calling out racism in therapy. Now, so when I read that, I'll admit my first instinct was, how can I do that? Because I was trained. So I was going back to my training, but understand my training was from 1978 to 82. But one thing that was drilled into me over and over is therapists do not influence the values of their clients. And so I went by that for the longest. And then in the sometime in the 90s, I had another kind of pivotal experience along this line. At the time, I was working with an adolescent female client and had good rapport. She came in one week and she started talking about a new boyfriend, and she was really excited and happy. But soon things got a little troubling for me because it turns out her boyfriend was apparently some version of a white supremacist. And she was buying into all of that. And I immediately was struggling, like, how do I deal with this? I'm thinking, oh, I'm not supposed to impose my values, but this troubles me. I want to do something, have some intervention to change that. I knew that I could at least talk about, what we all do with consequences of, our beliefs and behaviors, but it troubled me enough that I consulted widely. I actually got on a national listserv and talked about it. And the overwhelming opinion I got even back then was to focus on the relationship, don't try to change her values, but do continue to explore potential consequences of her beliefs and behaviors, but don't directly attack her beliefs. So I went with that. So once again, that approach was cemented into my mind. And so when I got that article, it made me wonder, okay, what to do. Now I have to admit, over the years, I have often questioned in my own mind and voiced it to others, can we really be value free as therapists? And so, yeah, it hit that kind of nerve already. So I decided what I would do is I would call Dr. Pat Griffin. Everyone knows Pat. And I says, I need to talk with her and let her help me think through this sort of thing. So I called her. We had a very helpful conversation. Since then, I've done more reading on the topic. And, I'm learning some new things that I, for whatever reason, I didn't get exposed to. I have tried to keep up over the years as a professional and a psychologist with my continuing education. My background is in training as a training director for interns and fellows certainly helped me stay somewhat abreast of some of the latest things going on, but that was just something that never came up. So we decided, Pat and I, after all that this would be a really good topic for the conference. And so I hope we can do that and maybe help us develop improvements in our work in this area. It certainly will for me. Help us be more effective as we try to move our clients and for that matter ourselves to more deliberate and thoughtful choices. And of course, Pat and I agreed one of the key things is that this is a respectful but frank exploration of the topic in a safe context, presuming goodwill on the part of all. That's our goal we'll work to maintain. So let me introduce the panelists. And maybe if you can kind of, as I say your name, you say something, just kind of highlight or else otherwise alert people to see who you are. Dr. Eric Pritchard, he's an assistant professor of psychology at the University of Arkansas Monticello, and he teaches a number of psychology courses and has supervised undergraduate research projects. Actually, since 2017, he has assisted ARPA in organizing the student research presentations at our fall convention. His recent research was published in Race and Policy, and that's, I think, going to be the primary thing he works on in his presentation. It's a review of the destructive roles that eugenic and racist ideas from 20th century psychologists still play in modern political discourse. Then we have Dr. Christina Jeffrey, who is an assistant professor in counseling psychology at the doctoral program at UCA, University of Central Arkansas. Her research interests include liberation psychology, post-colonial theory, social justice, and multicultural considerations in the clinical supervision and training of psychologists. Then we have Dr. Marie Messidor. Marie is the Central Arkansas Veterans Healthcare System's Health Behavior Coordinator. She uses a variety of evidence-based approaches in her work, and she also serves as the Diversity Committee Chair for Mental Health Services and provides clinical supervision to psychology interns and fellows. We have Dr. Leticia Duvivier, who is also the CAVHS VA's PTSD clinical team, one of their psychologists, and she's a member of the diversity committee for the VA. She also co-created and co-leads an effort at promoting social justice there in the facility. And she practices using a variety of evidence-based approaches, and currently her focus is on supporting oppressed and minority groups by directly working with racism in the therapy room. So you can see we've got a highly qualified panel, a lot of good information they'll be able to provide us. Unfortunately, we'll each have to confine ourselves to 15 minutes. So they'll be doing 15 minutes, and I'll help with them with a little cue near the end. And then after everyone is presented and I kind of finish up with a couple of things, then we'll go for the rest of the time into Q&A. And remember to go into the Q&A, not the chat. That way it's anonymous. So enter your questions anytime from now on. If one occurs to you, just put it in the Q&A in between Kyle and I. We will then at the end of the presentations cover all those questions and pose them to the panel. Okay, so let me start with a few things on my end. I am not the expert, they are, but I have some things I think might be relevant. Let's first just talk about some basic key terms. And panelists, I ask you to augment or correct as needed, but my best understanding from what I've read, and we're going to look at two terms, racial prejudice and racism. Racial prejudice has more to do with the internal attributes of a person, those negative beliefs or attitudes that a person might hold about a group, and that inevitably will lead to racist acts. And one of the things about that is when you have beliefs like this, they often become automatic, even unconscious at times, and it's just kind of the standard way people operate when they have that. Racism, on the other hand, involves more overt behaviors. They can be behaviors by an individual, a group, or an entire system or society, but they all tend to serve to in some way maintain a power differential over a marginalized group or create other negative impacts for a racial group. Okay, so as we do this panel, I think as psychologists, one of the things that we have to do, a central charge for us, is to use our skills and the science we're aware of for the good of clients and society. So I'm going to briefly mention a few ideas that I've looked at from my research that actually relate to a different topic that I presented at ARPA last year in terms of political polarization, but it deals directly with this as well. And it's kind of ironic. Usually when I'm talking about something, I'm concentrating on the nurture part, the nature-nurture controversy. I'm always about expanding on the nurture part. And many of the things that I have seen and I'm aware of in this literature and in this discussion have to do with the nurture part. This time I'm going to talk about a few things that may be more in the nature area because there's research that implicates biological, neurological, and evolutionary influences that can impact things like racism and racial prejudice. Those kinds of influences tend to be very emotional, they are often automatic and often not even conscious. So it's helpful for us to know that as well. First things we know, humans are social animals, just like bees, dolphins, ants, whatever, primates. And as social animals, the concepts we hear about a lot now are tribalism and group identity. Well, initially, it's helpful to understand that most experts in this field feel like that is something that developed and evolved early on in humanity's history because of survival value. Basically, humans survived in a wild, dangerous environment for thousands of years by banding together in groups. And if you were back then and you did something to anger the group or to otherwise isolate yourself and you're expelled, you would probably die fairly quickly. So the idea is that evolutionary pressure built up a strong predisposition in our brains to automatically ally with a group and adopt its beliefs. And the kind of thoughtful deliberation that maybe leads to some contrary thoughts is kind of a secondary thing that's a little bit more of an uphill climb. Now, it may be good in many ways to be group oriented, but the negative side of that automatic emotional instinct is that with it comes a tendency towards suspicion about the other, about groups that we're not part of. And I think that underlies some of the tendencies for some people to be prone or vulnerable to racist beliefs. Another factor to consider are cognitive factors. Another thinking about the way the brain evolved is that there was so much information available that it took so long to weigh everything. The brain developed shortcuts, you might call them, to simplify decision making and make it more efficient, which is good to an extent, but unfortunately the downside of that evolutionary development is that it leads to biases and therefore misjudgment. And racial prejudice can be one of those things that can result. But bottom line is, because of this pressure that's still in us biologically and neurologically, we don't change our minds very easily. Actually, one psychologist, Kaplan, talks about it's as if the brain has its own immune system like the body does. And the brain fights off new or different ideas or ideas that are not of our tribe as somehow, wrong or dangerous to us, as if the body's immune system is fighting off a dangerous infection. So we hold on to those values that our group has very strongly. And if we go against the tribe, we risk losing face with them. And our instincts seem to be not to do that. So they helped survival early on, but they also came with these negative impacts. And in modern society, that's especially true. We all know this from our own other experiences as therapists. For instance, think about the times in therapy when you're working with someone who has a problem with anger control and aggression. And so we have to work with emotional regulation. People whose sexual urges combined with other things, they act in ways that are against the norms of society. Even as simple something as stress management. When we talk about fight, flight, and stress management, don't we all in some way point out how it made sense way back then when we were worried about the warring tribes or the dangerous animals, but they don't fit in our current society. So these are all ways that we may have some of these innate tendencies, but it's our responsibility to rise above them. We need to be held, we are responsible, and society will hold us responsible for doing the right things despite those. That is one of the things that I think as psychologists we can help with folks who have difficulties in that area. That is our challenge. An interesting other thing is that there's evidence that attitudes and behaviors can be passed down through learning and culture as well, but they become at some point automatic. And if you remember Daniel Kahneman's fast and slow brain system, thinking something that becomes habitual, becomes ingrained and automatic, and you don't really think about it anymore. So our job for ourselves and for the clients we serve is to help them find ways to overcome those automatic, unconscious, fairly primitive instincts into a more conscious, thoughtful way of controlling our behavior and doing what's best for us and those around us. one of the things that Daniel Kahneman talks about in his fast versus slow system is the idea of slowing down, your behavior and your thinking. When you do that, you're reducing your emotions and you're increasing your reliance upon the higher level executive functions. And that delay allows you maybe to get a little more control over the fast instinctive reactions. So we have this opportunity as psychologists to help ourselves and others. And I think racism and racial prejudice are kinds of things that we can impact along with the other primitive and maladaptive urges. So that's kind of set things up. I'm going to now turn to our panelists. Remember, each will have 15 minutes, and audience, remember that during those discussions, enter your questions in the Q&A. That's anonymous. Don't enter them in chat, enter them in Q&A. And then Kyle and I, in some fashion, will help pose your questions after the panelists have completed their presentations. So we are going to start with Dr. Pritchard. Eric, you're ready to go.
So I'm coming at things almost completely from the academic side. I'm not a clinical psychologist. I actually got my PhD in experimental psychology. And typically now, most of the research I do is actually in the area of personality. So I've even moved away from experimental psychology, and I do a lot more correlational research. But when I started working at UAM, I started teaching history and systems of psychology. And in teaching history and systems and studying up for that, I became fully confronted with the extent to which the history of psychology is seeped in ideas related to eugenics and racism, to an extent that was shocking to me. And for years, I'd been disturbed by a trend of seeing people I considered intelligent, citing known researchers like Philip Rushton, Linda Gottfredson, in recent years, Jordan Peterson, psychologists who were publishing in journals that are considered legitimate journals, Personality and Individual Differences at Elsevier, APA journals, journals related to the Psychonomic Society, people who held posts at prestigious universities, real universities, arguing that there is a pervasive, biologically ingrained difference between people from different racial backgrounds and ethnic backgrounds pertaining to their cognitive ability. And I found it disturbing. And every time I bring it up in a class in graduate school or to a professor, I would get something along the lines of, well, I don't agree with that, but as a scientist, we have to fight it with the science, and we have to look at what the science says. And the effect sizes are small, and it turned into almost a completely purely academic argument. So when I started teaching history and systems, I started seeing a pattern going back over a century, starting with some of the early quote unquote luminaries in psychometrics, starting with people like Francis Galton, Carl Pearson, people like Ronald Fisher, the people who developed the statistical techniques and some of the early psychometric tests that we used were also hardcore eugenicists, and they were major defenders of the British Empire. And I started to suspect that those things were not coincidental. They were defenders of the idea of British imperialism, of the idea that the Anglo-Saxons, as they called themselves, were superior to the groups that were being colonized. They were defenders of the British class structure, and the idea that the emerging capitalism that was creating differences in wealth that were really being exacerbated in the cities like London and Birmingham were the result of natural genetic processes. And they'd really glommed on to Darwinian ideas. And Herbert Spencer infamously took Darwinian ideas, applied Darwinian ideas to sociology. And people like Fisher and Pearson and Galton saw differences in cognitive ability, quote unquote, as being genetically innate and as being evidence of the relative superiority of the quote unquote nobility in British society and the superiority of the British over other people. And very quickly, these ideas spread to America and became popular in America. We have to remember the United States has had a racist system for centuries, surge of racist ideas nationally. So not just a resurgence of pro-segregation laws in the South, but also a national resurgence of the Ku Klux Klan, Birth of a Nation, made the idea of the lost cause something rather romantic. And as much as it hurts me as a progressive, even the progressive movement bought into many eugenics ideas with the idea that we could improve human society by selectively breeding people or by encouraging certain types of people to have children, and even encouraging forced sterilization. So American psychologists like Robert Yerkes, who's famous for the Yerkes-Dodson curve and for being a famous sex researcher, did research for the military in regard to intelligence, where he strongly argued that people of color were less intelligent than white people. Henry Goddard is a famous psychologist who actually was a champion of forced sterilization and influenced policy in favor of forced sterilization in America. And people like Goddard and Yerkes were actually intellectual influences on Nazi Germany. So we had programs like forced sterilization programs that were largely targeted people who were poor and people of color well into the 1930s and 1940s. And in the nice version of the story that sometimes you get fed in school, World War II happens. We see the horrors of racism and eugenics unleashed on Germany. And in America, we learn our lesson. But we don't learn our lesson. In fact, in the 1960s, as recent as the 1960s, we have like the major civil rights legislation, Civil Rights Act, Voting Rights Act. And by 1969, you have Arthur Jensen arguing that things like Head Start are doomed to failure because people of color, Black people in particular, are just innately less capable than white children. And spending federal money on things like Head Start is doomed to failure. So in other words, only 4 years before had the federal government even intervened to try to enfranchise people, we still have economic disparities, there's still racism, there's still educational disparities, and Arthur Jensen, from a position of privilege at Berkeley, is saying Black people aren't capable of benefiting from federal help. And you're like, okay, well, that's 1960s. In the 1980s, J. Philip Rushton, a Canadian psychologist who died only in the last few years, argued that the prevalence of HIV in Africa is a result of people of sub-Saharan African descent being not only innately less intelligent than people in Europe, but actually having a completely different reproductive strategy, which he called the RK strategy. And the argument is that people who are of African descent are less intelligent, more aggressive, more sexual, and have a reproductive strategy in which they have more children because fewer of their offspring will survive. It's horrifying, but this is what he argued, and this was picked up by a mainstream psychology journal. And then he argues that AIDS policy in Africa might want to reflect this idea that people of sub-Saharan African descent are innately more sexual and more aggressive. Fast forward to the 2000s and 1990s. In the 1990s, Richard Lynn, a psychologist at Ulster, at University of Ulster, argues that the West is seeing dysgenic deterioration because of immigration from countries in sub-Saharan Africa and the Middle East and Latin America, and that there's a danger that quote unquote white genes will be diluted by immigration. Flash forward to 2005, Linda Gottfriedson argues, a professor, I think it's University of, I think it's New Hampshire, or Delaware, I think it's either Delaware or New Hampshire, but she argues in a chapter that affirmative action is doomed to fail because people of color are just not capable of benefiting from affirmative action. And in the background of all of this, you have the infamous bell curve by Charles Murray and Richard Herrnstein. And the bell curve argues that intelligence is a directly heritable trait, and that as a result of people not being capable of benefiting from social programs, it's a waste of money, and it's encouraging people who shouldn't have children to have children. And they actually make the argument that welfare encourages people we don't want to have kids to have kids. And there's a racial argument that underlies the bell curve, but Murray continues to make those arguments, and sometimes he tries to dodge around the issue of race, but disproportionately the programs that he's supported, which have been accepted by people like Bill Clinton, George H.W. Bush, George W. Bush, Jeb Bush, all people have praised Charles Murray. Those welfare reform programs disproportionately hurt people of color. And then we have the emergence of the alt-right. So now we have a century of research that has been accepted by mainstream peer-reviewed academic psychology journals, APA journals, APS journals, Psychonomic Society journals, that are being cited by alt-right white supremacist groups. So the infamous Richard Spencer heavily drew on this research when making sort of what he considered evolutionary and scientific arguments for the superiority of a white Western quote unquote society. Even sort of your soft, if you want to call them like softball white supremacists, your Jordan Petersons who don't quite identify with groups like the Proud Boys or Richard Spencer's groups, they still make arguments about the idea that hierarchy is natural and that it just might so happen that white men like Jordan Peterson are at the top of the hierarchy. And because these are people at prestigious universities, because they're publishing in journals that are legitimate journals, it becomes a way of sort of legitimizing these ideas. And every time as an academic psychologist, I bring up the ethics of this, the answer to the ethics is always, well, we have to fight it with the science. We have to fight it in the battle place of ideas. So we play this game where we pretend like science is valueless. Science doesn't have values. Science talks about facts. And yet they're playing a game where their version of the rules, they can make arguments implying that policies that have a serious ethical, moral impact on people are doomed to fail. They can make policies that denigrate people, that reinforce white supremacy, and make these proposals where our hands are tied because we're not being scientific, we're being emotional. We're not talking about the ideas, we're talking about our feelings, so therefore we have to be valueless. And by handcuffing ourselves like this, academic psychology has allowed this stuff to proliferate in the literature. And sure, they're not the majority views. Sure, there's a lot of science that counters that. But in a world where we have confirmation bias, in a world where memes and selective targeting influences people more than careful evaluation of the facts, it doesn't really matter if 99% of the articles say that it's bad science and one or two slip through. Is that one or two slipping through that are being used to give kind of intellectual undergirding to the alt-right, and it is successfully recruiting and influencing young people, and even educated young people. So I propose that science has to take the gloves off, in a sense, and start to see ourselves as ethical agents. And I propose that academic psychologists need to think about ethical agency in 4 ways. We need to think about how our science affects individuals. We need to think about how our science affects communities. So an individual person is an ethical agent, but the community they belong to is also an ethical agent. We need to think about our actions as ethical agents, and we need to think of the scientific community, the community of psychologists, as an ethical agent, which in other words means that we have to think of psychology as having collective responsibility for the outcomes of its science on both individuals and on communities, which is uncomfortable because that means that I've come to the view that the only way psychology can combat racism is if we collectively as a community take responsibility for what our science does and what it quote unquote says. So that means that by trying to handcuff ourselves and trying to make everything a sort of quote unquote intellectual argument about statistics and models and measurement in the sort of sterilized environment of the ivory tower, we are ethically culpable for the misuse of bad science. And that's sort of the position I'm at. And I think I'm just about out of time.
Okay, thank you, Eric. Great information, kind of sobering about the history of psychology and how it's contributed to people with racist worldviews. I'm thinking about your proposal about values as being really important. One of the arguments I've used before, we talk about basing everything we do in our interventions as being evidence-based. Well, the argument's been made more recently that we also need to be values-based. And I think that's what you're talking about. That's consistent with that argument. So for instance, we are held to our ethical standards, and we're supposed to do our practice for consistent with our ethical standards. Are we aware of any double-blind, placebo-controlled trials that demonstrate the efficacy of ethics and ethical standards? Of course not. So we are values-based as well as evidence-based, and I think that's consistent with what you're proposing. Okay, very good. The next person will be Dr. Christina Jeffrey. Christina, please go ahead.
Thank you so much. First off, I just wanted to share how encouraged I am to be with all of you today, and what an honor it is for me to be here with you and the brilliant people on this panel. I admit that I've been sitting with a lot of feelings of particular hopelessness and helplessness for a long while now. That's been escalating in light of racial inequality, but you all bring me hope, and I thank you for that. I apologize for how quickly I will be speaking. There's so much I realize I wanted to share, and of course cannot. So just play my part in slow motion when you look back on it, please. I decided to speak on the stages of racial identity development between clients and clinicians. In my opinion, where the client and clinician are in their stage of racial identity development will dictate the type of conversations you can have and what interventions might be best to try. And each stage comes with their own form of distress. There's also a risk in each stage for white supremacy to sneak in implicitly, and I'd like to propose a couple of warning signs for them. Just to be clear, I will only be talking about ways that clinicians can address racism in white clients, not ways to address internalized racism in clients of color, which is a very different conversation. I especially want to pose some points for any of the white clinicians that are listening to consider. I'll be covering all this by going stage by stage of Helms's model of white racial identity development, including information that's been informed by research, by my own clinical practice, and my own racial identity development. So first off, the contact stage is a stage where all white people start out, also known as our colorblind stage. You might see racial differences, but don't find it salient or important, and in fact might think that racism is propagated by the discussion and acknowledgement of it. It's just better if we just stop talking about it already. Distress in this stage usually comes from not understanding social unrest in the world, and oftentimes distress from no longer feeling as close to certain members of our family and friends. People in this stage put a lot of work into actively avoiding racism and may even cringe when race comes up because the topic is scary. This stage can occur even when the person has had tons of exposure to people of color, maybe even have dated or have people of color in their family. For me, and this is a bit of a bizarre metaphor, I know, but white people to me kind of live in a matrix sometimes. It's a pseudo-reality that feels mostly real, but some part of you can tell that something about the world you occupy never feels quite right. When they are first seriously introduced to the concept of the matrix, that their world of privilege isn't really reflective of the world as it really is, they are most likely to be quite defensive. When they're asked to leap from a building into awareness, they hold on to the ledge because after all, to finally discover that the world isn't fair or just or equitable as they were told is, upon first glance, absolute insanity. To make the average white person come to awareness of racism is to challenge how they were taught to see the world and who they are in it. It's a process of privileged unreality that began being formed 500 years ago. We know from working with individuals with active psychosis how terrifying even just a mildly loose grasp on reality is. Even just a little uncertainty with what is or isn't real is usually a sufficient condition for hospitalization. The act of becoming anti-racist goes further than this because the process isn't helping the individual come back to reality, but rather to find a true reality for the first time, the reality that they oppress other people. This is why I do want to challenge the idea that discussing racism in the room with a client in the contact stage is likely to elicit new distress. Based on professional and personal experiences, all whites are experiencing some form of distress from racism already, although awareness of the origin of it is usually lacking. Most can just tell that something is wrong with the world. The world is changing and they don't understand how to change in it. Social unrest confuses them. They don't understand why they're so isolated. And they think it's easier to fight global change, which is a fight they will lose, than to adopt change for oneself. And they don't realize that such change is actually a process that will set them free. Influences from white supremacy is actually in everything, which is a whole nother conversation, from the spices we use to the music we listen to how our bodies move to music, to where we build our homes and make rules for schools. I promise you, distress as a result of white supremacy is already present in some way, one way or another, in every white person's presenting complaint in therapy, whether unconsciously or unconsciously. The next stage, disintegration, is when the person is confronted and challenged by new information or a very salient experience that often elicits extreme feelings of guilt and shame. The individual is either fueled by the shame to move forward or they retreat. I personally think this is probably the stage that white clinicians are the most afraid of, and probably the stage they remember most vividly. However, I encourage clinicians sitting with this conflict, whether they believe that addressing this racism is more likely to facilitate positive change or not. After all, steering a client towards and through negative affect to the other side is more often seen with positive client outcomes than allowing them to sit on the other side of it, confused and alone. The next stage is the reintegration stage, which is our regressed stage, usually characterized by blaming the victim that whites have privileges because they deserve them. And they shouldn't have to feel bad about that then. But I find that they usually do. People in this stage usually are never fully able to shake the guilt and shame that they carry with them from the disintegration stage and are constantly working to overcome, to the point of physical and mental exhaustion, the cognitive dissonance to maintain racist beliefs. Clients in this stage, in my opinion, are usually the ones who've made assumptions about my own views on race and are often surprised or disappointed when I do not affirm racist beliefs. I know I've had at least 2 clients that when I did not affirm their racist comments that they casually made in our intake session, I never saw them again. It's interesting to me that both clients were women with longtime inconsistent patterns and very thick files, which stated they met criteria for borderline personality disorder, hard substance abuse, and prolific histories of sexual assault. This is by no means to argue that racism is, comorbid with a personality disorder or something. We don't have much research at all on it. But it does beg further exploration in the future as to what might be some personal factors that makes a white person more or less likely to become anti-racist. I hypothesize that a poor self-concept or inability to see one's sense of self-worth outside the mistakes they make likely complicates the anti-racist process. Complex trauma, in my opinion, influences a white person's tolerance for growing in this very painful way. A person needs to see that a bad action, like an act of racism, does not mean they are worthless. It just means they have something they need to change. For this reason, though, the manner of addressing racism is going to be different with each client because of their history of trauma, their current level of distress, their views of themselves, and their existing coping skills. Some might not even be able to hear the word racism, but may still respond well to interventions and conversations around race, as well as what racism is costing them. The next stage, and speaking a little bit faster now, is pseudo-independence, which is the first positive stage of racial identification. The individual does not believe that whites deserve privilege and feel deeply uncomfortable about it, but they tend to look to people of color to help them define their own race and to uncover racism. They don't understand in this stage how they can be both white and anti-racist together. In my professional experience, the stage can also look similar to bargaining. The person may look for forgiveness from people of color in some way and ask for the shame they feel to be taken away from them. But we know from our clinical work that we can't take away another person's sense of shame. They have to pull it up from the roots themselves. I also call this, I think white people are trash stage, which is the very millennial term. It's a cognitive inability motivated by shame and pessimism to differentiate racism, which is objectively bad, from the person who, like every other human on the planet, is not objectively bad, but is instead one who humanly errs. Interestingly enough, the white people as garbage is also an example of white supremacy in cognitions. This white supremacy in this case comes from a history of assigning certain values to race. Historically, it was whites are the best, they have the most value, and they are made in God's image. People of color are worse, and it's a ranking of 5 systems that was created in part by social psychologists, our professional ancestors, which they did to justify colonization, slavery, and sadly, even genocide. When a white person begins to see all white people as trash, they don't realize they're engaging in the same pattern of supremacist thinking that races have inherent values, and that they've just swung the opposite direction from thinking whites is good to thinking whites are the worst. In reality, where we want our white clients to get is realizing that race has no value in dictating how much value someone has. People have value. Usually, clients in this stage, I think, benefit from exploring these unconscious thoughts, but going through it explicitly might not be necessary for everybody. Of course, like there might be people even sitting with this thing, white participants here might be thinking, of course, I never saw my white race as better. I just knew that I held unconscious beliefs of other races. But in reality, whites have a very skewed perception of the self themselves. And if you need scientific evidence of this, I encourage you to look at Kenneth Clark and Mamie Phipps Clark's doll study, in which both white and Black children selected the white doll as beautiful and good and the Black doll as ugly and bad. You can look at racial identity development models across all of the races, and everyone of every race starts out believing this value-based lie that white equals good. There's hope in this stage, though, because processing this with a client and how they view themselves and other races can leverage them into their next stage of racial identity, which is the immersion and immersion stage. In this stage, the white person makes a genuine attempt to connect with their own identity and to become anti-racist. This is when the individual is ready to explore who they really are and see themselves as both a white and ethnic being. They tend to crave connection to other whites who are also in this stage. And this is when it is critical to afford the compassion you were given in your own development to the client in the same stage. In truth, the concept of shaming others for their ignorance or past racist actions comes very naturally to whites. And this is why I get a bit of a migraine when white people claim this is the first time in history they've really been able to cancel other white people. In reality, canceling is a strong Eurocentric practice. Ostracism, falling from grace, the concepts of being pure versus impure and corrupt were prevalent cultural practices in the countries that colonized almost all of the world. It was a way of weaponizing class, and class discrimination was a way of creating oppression amongst whites. We know from our own clinical experience what happens when we cancel or judge a client. We know what that's going to do to the therapeutic alliance. We know the importance of empathy, of patience, of congruency, humility, authenticity, and meeting the client where they are at. Even and especially for clients who have committed objectively bad acts, we want to provide empathy to stop doing these acts and to provide compassion for the person who still has worth. Furthermore,
we have just a couple of minutes left.
Yes, I'm good on it.
Good.
Thank you. Furthermore, we're all trained in these traits too. We know from research and practice that the alliance is the foundation on which change occurs. If we really want to help people change, we need to build the safe environment for them or transfer them to someone else who can. I don't know of a single clinician who has enjoyed working with an actively racist client, but we can't cancel or expect clients to suddenly meet us at the same stage that we're at. But this is where the stage becomes encouraging and really paves the way for the final stage of autonomy. It's the stage where we can guide the client into realizing they have a culture. They have a culture as a race, which is a little discouraging at times when you realize how many practices center around supremacy. But all whites have cultures as members of their ethnicity as well. And for the first time, whites begin not to see themselves as cultureless or even alone. All of a sudden, they have histories, they have practices and cultural strengths and behaviors that suddenly make sense in light of where their families come from. In this way, white people really break out of that matrix. The world begins to make more sense because they understand themselves within it. And upon that, the individual can begin to craft an anti-racist identity. They move beyond that pessimism and they begin to feel more connected with others. The final stage is characterized by liberation and the active pursuit of social justice. A person in this stage has a positive identification with their race and is no longer defined by shame or self-hatred. I promise you that liberation is already a part of your treatment plans. It just might not be so explicit. But if there's anything I can leave you with, is that I think the most racist people I've ever worked with have also been the loneliest. And this is my last point. They're so lonely, they're so afraid of the world, and racism is like bricks. Each act is like placing one brick on top of the other until they're surrounded on all sides by very thick walls. What's on the other side of this wall and this final stage of autonomy is actually liberation. It is so freeing, it is not as scary, and it is not lonely. But the higher the wall gets, the harder it is for the person to see what's on the other side, and much easier for them in their imaginations to create monsters in their mind. So I always encourage moving forward with that liberation because this process is ultimately deeply therapeutic and ultimately freeing. So thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Christina. That was fascinating and some helpful ideas to think about. I found myself wondering where I fit into the stages of, I guess everybody does that. Okay, so now coming up, we have Dr. Marie Messidor. Marie, go ahead and let's hear from you.
Okay, thank you, Dr. White. It's a pleasure to be here with you all today. And I'm going to start with a couple of disclaimers. First, Dr. White mentioned I work at the VA, and I'll be talking about some of my work at the VA. However, I'm not representing the VA. I'll be sharing just information and practices, actually from most of them from things that we've done in the past that can be helpful for a variety of organizations. Dr. Jennifer Kelly this morning spoke a lot about health equity. And really that health equity is about making sure that our organizations are responding to the unique needs of different groups to make sure that individuals aren't disadvantaged and to really combat health disparities. And so there's a real importance for us to take an organizational perspective when we're looking at promoting healing and justice. Another thing is that right now in our healthcare, we're really focused on patient-centered care and also relationship-centered administration in terms of just making sure that we do not forget why we're providing the care that we are. We want to respect and have partnership with the individuals that we're serving, as well as the people that we're working with. And when we work in diverse organizations, and most of our organizations are, and we're serving diverse organizations, it's really important to be mindful of that. Cultural humility is something that really can be very helpful for us all. And cultural humility is defined as a lifelong commitment to self-evaluation and self-critique, a desire to fix power imbalances where none ought to exist, aspiring to develop partnerships with people and groups who advocate for others. And so that really focus on self-evaluation and critique is important for every single one of us, because we know that we all have biases. As a person of color, I have to be aware of my biases, and I have to continually be aware of them. And we need to do that as institutions as well. And so some of the work that I've done has really looked at helping train our staff as well as our trainees to do a better job in terms of relating to one another in a diverse setting and providing care that meets all of the needs of our diverse clients. So I'll start with my past work with our internships and our fellowship. developed a cultural exploration and self-awareness seminar that really created a safe space to explore issues of our multicultural society and how we can better structure our services to meet the needs of the people that we're serving. It waxed individuals to meet together monthly to discuss important issues and read important articles. Also, got individuals, not only our trainees, but our staff out in the community to visit culturally relevant sites. And so I think that's important. As well as there were self-reflection assignments to really write down based on things that we've read from articles, how these things applied, not only just to themselves, but the clients that they were working with. And then we as a organization, we did form a committee really focusing on the multicultural society that we have to better serve not only our clients, but also to better work with each other in just collaborative ways. And so one of the things that we started off doing was just knowing that we had a diverse staff and that we really had to make sure that we helped individuals understand differences and better relate to each other. So we researched the literature and we came up with a 3-hour interactive training that highlighted cultural humility, focused on ways that each of us have multicultural elements. So every person in this country, whether person is white or black or Asian or whatever your background, we all have multiple dynamic aspects of ourselves. So it's not just one identity that we have, we carry so many different ones. And so it's important for us to be aware of what are the important ones that we carry, how have we each experienced hurt because of how we've been judged by others, and how can we support one another with that. So we've had activities in small groups to discuss those things. We looked at stereotypes and where they came, and how can we be better bystanders to support each other when individuals are dealing with those. We also had individuals complete a cultural competence assessment that looked at skill and awareness that really helped individuals identify things that they can do in terms of their clinical practice to increase skill and have discussions. And we looked at and asked individuals to develop an action plan for themselves as well as what they can do in their work areas. So we tried to make it very interactive with small groups and discussions, vignettes, as well as video clips. And we had these trainings for about a couple of years. And so we would have small groups come together. Not necessarily small, but maybe about 13, sometimes 10, sometimes a little bit more, but never more than 20, and have these discussions. And we did ask people to provide us feedback on terms of how they find this training to be. And so I'll read one of the great, really very nice feedback that talked about our training. So one person said, this was an extremely helpful workshops. The tools learned, I'll be able to apply and use in practice. And that was really the heart of it. It was really about helping individuals have a space to feel comfortable to come together to talk about these issues and apply it in their practice, not only with the clients that they're serving, but in terms of working with each other, because sometimes that's a barrier. If we're not relating well with each other, we may not be really meeting the needs of the clients that we're serving. And then during this time of COVID-19, our committee has also tried to reach out and create space for just everybody in our facility to have the opportunities to come and talk about how things have impacted them, to really consult the research. And so we've had great opportunities to do that and great response in terms of a lot of people participating for discussions about COVID-19 and how that's been led into some of the health disparities and what we can do. Also how we've dealt and coped with race-based stress and ways that we can get together to promote health equity in our system. One of the things that we've been really focused on that I think is important, and it's important for a lot of organizations to do, is to think about ways of creating a pipeline for diverse hiring in the future. So we started an open house, really reaching out to college students as well as young professionals to meet with our diverse staff and learn about our services. And so we had, the first year was last year, we had about 21 participants, and feedback was overwhelmingly positive. And so this year, our in-person event got affected by COVID-19, but we are definitely committed to having future open houses. One thing that I'm so excited to share about that's happening within our system, and I did not develop this, but colleagues in other VAs developed a race-based stress, trauma, and empowerment group. And I think this is just such a wonderful service that they've done. Dr. Carlson, Ensley, Motley, Shanahan, as well as Williams and Dr. Ross and Hubbard. I think in the materials you have, there's an article that talks about this group. And so it's really awesome that they really consulted with the literature and over a series of years developed a group to help individuals cope with race-based stress and trauma that they've experienced either in their personal civilian lives or in maybe their past military experience. And so many of us are used to helping individual clients cope with maybe experiences of discrimination, but there's a real power when people are meeting together with other people who had those experiences. And they're also learning about how the literature and how some of these concepts can help them for self-empowerment, and not to just focus on just coping with discrimination, but how to thrive even despite those experiences. So it's an 8-week group that meets for 90 minutes. And it really incorporates wonderful services that we have that's research-based, like mindfulness practice, cognitive restructuring from CBT, emotional regulation from DBT, values from ACT, empowerment. And so within a group setting, people can get that help. Another wonderful part about this is that there's consultation. And that's one thing that organizations can really do better, is to help people who are helping individuals who are struggle by having a consultation group. So throughout this system, the developers of this program have consultation for people who are going to get started to deliver this intervention. And so those monthly consultation meetings, you get to participate with the developers and the trainers who are experts in this area, as well as other people who are implementing this or have done that. And you may be starting at the beginning. And so you learn about how to handle challenges that may happen in a group. How do you deal with perhaps people not using, maybe somebody's used a racial slur, and how does that impact other people? And maybe that person was talking about their own trauma, and how do you support people? So just as Dr. White was talking about earlier, a lot of times we've received training a long time ago. We're not sure how to handle some of these issues. So you get to have that support with consultants, I'm sorry, as well as colleagues and peers to support you. So that model, I think, is really awesome. And I think that's one of the wonderful things about the work that we're doing, is that there are things like that coping with race-based stress group for individuals. And when you think about how pervasive these experiences are for individuals, I've worked with people who they're talking about experiences that happened maybe 40 years ago, but it's still like it is today. And that's one of the things that a lot of researchers have really made an argument for, is that in terms of our diagnostic systems, we have post-traumatic stress disorder, but that doesn't really incorporate experiences of discrimination, of racism, of challenges that have happened in the past. And so many people may be struggling and not getting the support and the services that they need. And so it's really important for us to be mindful of that. That a lot of these experiences are lasting and they're very hurtful. They are really impacting physical health and mental health in ways that we probably didn't really understand as much 30 years ago, because there's a recent body of literature that just highlight that these everyday experiences, even though they make some people feel, maybe, oh, I just need to be able to cope with this. Maybe they experienced something that was very blatantly racist 40 years ago, but during the past 10 years, they've had slights that they've experienced as ways of feeling invalidated. And so that's contributed to the sense of traumatization and this overall sense of that their work life is not valuable, and that impacts how people cope as well. And so that's an important thing for us all just to really be mindful of, that as mental health professionals, do we fully understand the full range of it? And a lot of times when clients are talking to us about their experiences, they may not highlight some of those experiences, especially if they are people of color, because they may not realize that, hey, this person will be able to help me with this, or maybe they don't think that this is the space to bring this up, or they just think this is the way it is, I've just got to deal with it. And so one of the things that was really nice about the development of this group is that when the developers advertised it, they actually advertised in primary care. A lot of primary care providers were able to refer for people who might not have even been brought to these services, who may have been meeting with therapists for depression or other things, substance use, and who may not have brought up these issues. So it's important to think about, are we creating space for individuals to really get help to deal with the discrimination that they experience? Because there's so much about of our society where people think about this as just things you just got to deal with. But wonderfully, there are ways in which people can thrive and support. Dr. Ensley, when I told him I was going to do this presentation, they were happy that I would share information about their work. But unfortunately, they say they're limited in terms of how much consultation they can provide. And so I think we've been fortunate just to be aware of the work that they're doing and to collaborate and be a part of that. And so I think in closing, I think that's one thing I would just share with this group, is that it's really important to think about how discrimination impacts individuals in terms of, does it contribute to elements of trauma? Even if individuals aren't meeting criteria for PTSD, do they need something more? Do I need to give this more focused attention? And if you are providing group services, consider incorporating some of the elements. Read the article. The article's titled "Addressing the Impact of Racism on Veterans of Color, a Race-Based Stress Intervention," and it was from 2018. Read that article and incorporate that into your work. And final closing point would also be that if you are working with a group of individuals and not in private practice, getting together and really thinking about ways that you can talk about structuring your services. One of the things that was helpful for us, and the things that we've done in terms of our committee, is just to have that dialogue, have that space, bring the literature, having individuals read the literature and having space for that, to think about how can we adapt our services, how can we adjust our practices. And even though, for me, I know I am fully embracing these concepts, but I have to be self-reflective. So all of us, we have to be self-reflective. We have to be mindful of our practices. Our offices, do they communicate that, hey, diversity is welcome here? Do we have the right pictures in our space? So making that time to really focus on that and creating that welcoming environment, and helping our clients who are coping with challenges with discrimination to thrive, as well as just, and not just to deal with things and just cope, but thrive and heal is one of the things I think we need to move forward towards as a society. And as an organization, as organizations, and as well as a mental health field. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Marie. That's great information. I appreciate you incorporating the issue of trauma into this topic. And having been at the VA and worked with you, I'm not surprised to hear all the good work that's being done at the VA in this area and the work that you're doing. So thank you for that. Remember that you have, for all the audience, remember we do have references that I think were provided. You should have those. If not, maybe raise that issue in the chat. But the panelists all provided some references that relate to the discussion today that you might find helpful going forward. So our last panelist presentation is with Dr. Leticia Duvivier, who is also from the VA. And Leticia, please go ahead.
Thank you, Glenn. So I would also like to make a disclaimer that, just like Dr. Mesidor, I am not representing the VA in this capacity and my presentation with the panel. But I would like to speak a little bit about my journey in developing as a therapist and helping clients with issues surrounding racism in the therapy room, to provide some context, and then hopefully discuss a case or two if there is time. So essentially, my journey started with basically the issues that clients were bringing to the therapy room. I am a PTSD therapist here at our PTSD clinical team, and a number of clients would bring up that they were on the receiving end of racism. Sometimes these experiences were, like Dr. Mesidor said, from decades ago, but really pivotal in people's lives. Sometimes folks would come in and they were the ones that were identifying as racist, and they expressed various levels of distress with this. They would say, I've noticed that once since I've come back from, the Middle East, I cannot be around people of this background or this ethnicity. Sometimes they were distressed about this, sometimes they were not. And I was feeling pretty unprepared to address that, especially if clients were identifying as, feeling like they were racist. And sometimes they wanted help with that and explicitly asked for it. So I devised a couple of plans within the therapies that we are able to offer, cognitive processing therapy, prolonged exposure. Those were the ones I was primarily offering at the time that are evidence-based therapies for trauma. And of course, I went and consulted with a number of colleagues and wasn't really satisfied with what I heard. And so, like Glenn, when he was speaking about the beginning of his career and being sort of really drilled onto that we respect people's rights and dignity, right? Principle E of our ethics code. We respect people's autonomy and their right to self-determine. I heard a lot of that, right? Like, we cannot impose our beliefs. Clients have a right to their beliefs. And I also heard a lot of, we're a trauma clinic. We treat fear. We don't treat hate. Which I had a strong emotional reaction to that. And there was a lot of sort of discomfort too with a variety of colleagues across the country that I've consulted with about the issue. A lot of emotional reactions, and then a lot of sort of like, I don't know, send them to the Southern Poverty Center for tolerance training. And personally, I just didn't feel that was enough. These were people that were coming in distress, asking me for help, and I wanted to do more, and I felt responsible to do more. And so going back to what Dr. White was saying, we do have a reference list, and a couple of things that were very helpful for me in figuring out how to move forward with this. They're actually reflected in some of our references. Drustrup has an article that is very helpful. It has a model on how to work with these issues. This author, I do not know how to pronounce their name, so I apologize to the author. Mbro and colleagues in their Prejudiced Patients article is also very helpful, and Bartoli has been very helpful. But basically, I started trying to increase my own competence because my training was not stellar in this area, in the area of diversity. And I just was never taught how to address it in the therapy room. And what some of these authors reflect is that we need to strike a balance between the principles of, respecting people's rights and their dignity and their autonomy, with also principle B of the ethics code, that we need to also be aware of our responsibility to society and to the communities in which that we work. We need to also try to eliminate the effects on our work. This is principle E of the biases based on social identity factors, and to not knowingly participate or condone activities that are based on these prejudices. And so this more recent literature has been giving voice and helping find ways to incorporate ways to do some of what Dr. Pritchard was talking about. We need to do as a community and with the literature, but also in the therapy room. So that's been very helpful. And I started my journey on that just basically with self-education and self-reflection, like Dr. Mesidor was just talking about. So a lot of reading. And one of the efforts that I started here at the VA was a book club. So just an informal discussion group for staff to participate and trainees to participate, and where we could pick the literature that we wanted to consume and explore, and then share our reactions. And my hope was that, you know, there has to be somebody out there other than me that also feels that they could benefit from not just, you know, being shocked by the killings of George Floyd and then hoping the world would change, but actually like wanting to learn more and improve their own development and share their own reactions and support one another, and hopefully becoming anti-racist in our practices. So I started the Racial Justice Book Club, and I have a lot of support from a colleague, Dr. Domino here. And that has been an interesting process. I was asked to talk to you guys a little bit about that. We have been meeting for a few months, like maybe 2 or 3 months. We started out by reading White Fragility as a group and discussing it. We've discussed the Black Power Mixtapes documentary. We discussed the UALR's Project Mapping Renewal website that, you know, I can later share with anyone that's interested. We're currently working on reading, and we'll be discussing The Souls of Black Folk by W.E.B. Du Bois. And I'm considering suggesting to the group that we read some of the articles that are on your reference list next, you know, as far as bringing this work into the therapy room, Drustrup and Mbro. So with the book club, you know, attendance is sort of waxed and waned, and we've tried to follow a format that has been suggested for other book clubs in general. So basically, Dr. Domino and I have some ideas about materials, but we encourage actively that people would suggest their own materials that they would like to read and discuss. We try to balance different forms of media. We try to balance things focused on process versus things focused on historical content. And we try to have some discussion questions prepared, but we love it, and the group shines when people just bring in organic discussion. We also encourage people to come even if they haven't been able to read the material, although we have quite a few people that are very compliant and very nice and very perfectionistic and want to make sure that they hit everything. So I've also been doing a lot more personally as far as reading and consuming material to improve my own cultural competence. And essentially been following, you know, with a couple of clients where this has shown up and been relevant, fairly closely to the models and the references provided. And so once I started reading and, you know, preparing to do a little bit of this work, it was sort of a challenge, you know, because one of the things that's quoted in those articles is that we can be worried about being neutral in the therapy room and not offending our clients, et cetera. But some of our authors will say that under disguise of neutrality, we can become paralyzed. And I was worried that that was happening to me, which is what prompted me to seek a different course. Drustrup will say too, that although needing to build competence is a real thing, you know, and it can, you know, we can pose a true risk to harm in clients if we're not building competency. The other side is that we may occasionally feel like we're never prepared enough. So I just decided at one point that I'm not going to sit here and not help people address these things anymore. So a couple of scenarios that present often in my clinic are that somebody had a bad experience with somebody from a different, you know, cultural group. They went to the Middle East, and a lot of the other group were terrorists, or they were in training and they were assaulted by somebody from a person of color. So Glenn, let me check in with you about timing before I launch into discussion of cases.
You've got a good 5 minutes.
About 5 minutes?
Yeah.
Okay. So a couple of cases, one pretty typical case that we see here is someone who's had a bad personal experience, and like say Mr. Doe, he's had a bad experience. He was assaulted by someone from a different ethnicity in boot camp. And he is at a place in his development that he can identify that he doesn't want to have negative feelings towards people of color. Conceptually, he doesn't want to be a racist, but he is getting these reactions, these physical reactions, and he is interpreting, he's labeling people based on their race. Whenever there is a negative interaction, he is worried that he's passing this down to his children and so on. So initially, this is a type of case that some folks might say, send them to the Southern Poverty Law Center to help him with that. Well, I've decided to incorporate, some of this in his prolonged exposure therapy. And so even because this we treat fear and not hate argument, I'm personally not completely sold that in some instances, hate doesn't have to do with fear. So we followed a lot of what's suggested in these articles myself, and I have a trainee also helping me with this case now. First, building a really strong alliance with the client, and validating and empathizing with what the client is bringing. This is something that's very active in another case of mine too, where the person is saying very racist things and not aware, of the impact of their racism. So validating this is very, very challenging for me to be in the room and hearing racist things like, I want to take an AK and mow down the protesters. This is very difficult. And what we are reminded of in some of these models is that we're not really validating the content, but we're validating the emotion and the experience, the interpretation. Like if I were seeing it this way, I might be feeling a similar way. And that I've found to be crucial in this prolonged exposure case, and also in an EMDR case that I'm seeing with a person that's more racist and less aware of their racism at this time. So a lot of sort of patience, figuring out where the client is at. Are there issues of clinical risk that are going to supersede, addressing these issues? How are the client's relationship to people of color impacting their own lives? Is there a cost to their lives that, themselves and people around them that could be used as a motivator and that's doing them harm that could be addressed in therapy? And so just balancing what's the likelihood of the effectiveness of an intervention. Should I be able to build a rapport with the clients to do so? So the Bertoli article is also very helpful in talking about how to conceptualize, racism in clinical terms in a way that might relate to the client's presenting concerns as well. So, doing a lot of this and building a strong alliance. One of the things that I have done with my EMDR case is sort of after empathizing, right? Then we start to create dissonance between what their purported values are and some of this thinking and this behavior, and highlighting the benefit to themselves and to people around them, their grandchildren, their spouses, etc., of maybe exploring to see things in a different way, and then inviting exploration. So then techniques that, some techniques that Dr. Mesdor talked about are used in the group, like creating distance from our thoughts, acceptance and commitment therapy, Socratic challenging and sort of exploring these issues, not in an adversarial way, but in a collaborative way, can be very helpful. So this is something that I've done with a client in preparation for EMDR, knowing that we were going to be processing things related to the rage that he felt connected to race. And sort of started probing, the depth of the beliefs, how much he was attached to this, to also help improve my case conceptualization, but gauge the flexibility of the client. and so on. And it's proved actually very beneficial because the alliance was strong enough. And one of the things that I've done that isn't in any of these articles, but in inviting exploration, I sort of, probed this, challenged a little bit, saw his response, and then I asked him, do you know why, like, why am I having this conversation with you? Because this is pretty uncomfortable. So what's your guess as to why we're talking about these uncomfortable things and I'm asking you all these questions? And to my shock and surprise, he said, because you're trying to help me. And I said, oh, yeah, that's true. How does it fit in your head that I'm trying to help you this way? And he says, because I am living with rage and I'm simmering in rage and you're trying to help me through it. And I don't really understand or agree everything that you're doing, but I know that's where we're going. And I say, okay, is it okay with you if we continue this conversation? And he says, yes. And from there, we went on to process the targets, traumatic targets, big T's and little T's, like bullying and racism in childhood.
Leticia, got a minute left.
Okay. That were connected with the rage that he has, that is being displaced onto the protesters and on people from minorities that have even less power than he does. So, in exploring the function of the rage has also been very important. We've been doing some of that in conversation, some of that even throughout EMDR as cognitive interweaves, and he's starting to recognize that with validation that he needed the rage. He needed, there was no other way for him to not grow up thinking a certain way, and that he no longer needs those schemas. He no longer needs those behaviors. So we're only halfway through, but that's been very successful, very scary, and also very rewarding for me as a therapist to help this person do better. I've been able to, first I had to choose the risk to beneficence to the clients versus the principle of general beneficence to society. And now they're coming together and reconciling, and that this client is now saying that he hates racism. And it's not on me to impose on him to become an anti-racist, but I wouldn't be surprised if he does.
Thank you, Leticia. That was wonderful. I really appreciate hearing the stories about your work with the clients. And yeah, that last one was particularly remarkable. Well done. Okay, well, I thank everybody, the panelists for their presentations. I remind everybody to put questions in the Q&A, and then we'll have some time here in a few minutes. I'm going to cover a couple of things, and that'll give you some time if you want to go ahead and put your questions in. What I was wanting to do is just talk about a few considerations from my perspective about, if you're going to work with clients in therapy and how to, regarding racism, how do you do that? Now, I'm not the expert, and I'm hoping to hear some other things besides what's already been mentioned, but just a few general concepts. One is we know about positive behavioral support, right? One of the things in that model is when you encounter a problem, the first thing is to figure out what function is that behavior playing. That's the functional analysis part. So what does a person gain from a particular behavior? And then when you figure out what the function of that behavior is, that problematic behavior, focus on how you can help them learn and promote a more positive alternative behavior that takes the place and hopefully is incompatible with that behavior and yet still offers similar gains or reinforcements. So that would be one thing I think would be a good way to go into thinking about that. So you might ask, well, so what does a person gain from racism? And I don't know, that would be the kind of thing you'd explore with them. A couple of things that come to mind is that for someone who has maybe a fragile self-esteem, they may gain some sense of superiority, or somehow they feel like it builds them up. Although one can certainly argue it does not, but that may be something they perceive as a gain. One of the things I've talked about already is group acceptance, that there are some people out there, there are some groups where racist attitudes and behaviors will be totally consistent with that group, and you can gain some group acceptance. And if you haven't had experience with being accepted by a group elsewhere, sometimes those lower level groups in society where there are more problems offer that, unfortunately. So what is a positive alternative to racism and racist behavior? I don't know, maybe valuing our common humanity, appreciating the individual struggles we all go through. I don't know. So how do we do all this work? You know, the positive alternatives, the positive behavioral support. Well, that's our job. That's what we get paid the big bucks for, right? It's our task in therapy to figure that out. Let's raise that point. Another thing I think is really important, this is the role of relationships. We know in our field, so much of the importance in terms of change in psychotherapy has to do with the nature of the relationship between the client and therapist. Well, we also know it from other things. You know, if you look at like psychotherapy involving family therapy, couples work, parenting, you know, social skills training, so on and so on. There are so many ways in which a key part of the intervention has to do with building positive relationships. One of the things, of course, for that is, you know, what I call and has been called something like the 5-to-1 rule, to try to create, you know, many more positive, affirming kinds of interactions with a person than you do negative or rejecting interactions. So it's clear that having positive relationships and building that can help. Another thought, of course, has to do with motivational interviewing and that kind of concept that we don't always need to directly confront the problem or the issue, because sometimes that arouses a defensive reaction, you know, psychological reactance, so that you may actually keep people further away from the change that would be beneficial to them. So where you can help them discover on their own something, that is often a very helpful way to approach things. Then another thing from the expressed emotion research in families, I think that one thing that strikes me about that is that it's important to keep emotion at moderate to lower levels, because when you get high emotion in the family, it generates problems, particularly for those who are more vulnerable in the family. And subsequent research in that area has shown that that's true with all sorts of groups, and I would propose it's true in society at large. The more we have lots of emotions, the more primitive we get, and the more negative things get in the society. So to the extent that we can do things that keep the emotions lower, kind of gradually lower the emotional tone, that's a good thing. And with Kahneman's fast and slow processing, that's also consistent to allow for slower processing and using higher levels of your brain for something other than figuring out how to fight or flee the problem. And then, you know, Letitia was talking about, and I really appreciate that, the way she talked about ethical principles and how to balance them, because it's certainly true that it's not just a simple cookbook matter of following an ethical principle or guideline. Usually our big ethical dilemmas are when they are in competition with each other. She mentioned one, I would mention another, like, for instance, in psychotherapy, if we encounter racism, one side, one consideration in terms of the principle of autonomy might be, okay, well, autonomy says I respect the client's autonomy. I don't try to influence their values, which is probably where I came from originally. But there may be others, but this is one that strikes me as beneficence, is that, you know, we're supposed to help do good with our clients. And would it not be good to help the client discover, just like Letitia was talking about in her case, for ways clients to become more self-aware and to be their best selves. And in doing that, they may become more functional members of society and experience more positive consequences. Perhaps there are negative consequences if they belong to a group that values that kind of a negative viewpoint, but that would be another opportunity to, you know, kind of expand your social network. So the bottom line is that when we're in therapy working with folks, then I think we always be mindful that we're having a balancing act, that there are competing goods. There's this notion of competing goods that's talked about in other areas, but it's always that rather than say, well, you got to do one or the other, actually both of them are important considerations. You just got to figure out where the right line is to balance the two. and that's not always clear where that line is. So that's something you would do together with the client. So I guess to conclude then, I'd say at this point, what I heard actually a friend of mine mentioned recently when I told him what I was going to be doing here, he said he thinks with all the things going on in our country now, society seems at a turning point. He sees it as a metaphor of like an intervention in addiction, that it's like our country is going through an intervention for our addiction to racism. And so this is an opportunity. Hopefully this intervention works and we get people into recovery and manage to move toward mastery of those primitive, more hateful and counterproductive automatic attitudes and behaviors, and replace them with something that's a little more human and thoughtful. And as psychologists, I maintain we are probably, I can't imagine any discipline that's better suited in their training to contribute to that effort. So we're now going to move to questions from the audience. I think I'll start with some of those, and then Kyla will help me out on that. So let's look at the Q&A. Here's one. Oh, boy, this first one, we could spend the rest of the time on this, so we probably shouldn't, but here's one of them. This one says, I was distressed to hear a Black female client of mine tell me that her mother's therapist, a white male, was using the mother's therapy session to vent about the protest. He was against them. And he was talking openly about his love of the current president. What is the limit within our profession to protect clients from clinicians who are engaging, in my opinion, in unethical and damaging behavior? I worked with my client to give her names of trusted clinicians who will not treat the mother in that way, and the client's mom was able to successfully change therapists to someone much more appropriate and helpful. As an aside, the client's mother reportedly never brought up racial issues. The therapist just went off the rails. Okay. Panelists, it's time to provide some answers, or at least some thoughtful responses there. Who wants to go first? Marie, you need to unmute yourself.
That is a very difficult one. So it seems like this person never had any interaction with the therapist who was making those statements. So that's, I guess, an important consideration. I know that our field in general has a way that as psychologists, we can definitely let our board know about those things. But I think our ethics codes does ask us to first try to intervene with somebody in terms of having a conversation if we have a colleague who we feel is not behaving in a way that is providing ethical care to somebody. That's a very hard situation. I don't know that many people would feel empowered to, even if it was your colleague, approach that person. So, I mean, going through our board is one thing, talking to a colleague, but I think probably what this person ended up doing in terms of helping that family to find somebody else is really important. But I think we do have to think about, as a field, how do we protect the field, right? So if we have a whole bunch of people having experiences with psychologists who are providing unethical care, that's not right. And so I think probably most of us are reluctant to report colleagues because we want to be fair to them, right? So having that discussion first, if that happens, I mean, I can't specifically speak to this example here, but I think that if you do have a colleague who is providing some type of care that's you question, it might be helpful to first get consultation from somebody else who it was within the organization, identify a strategy, but then also first directly having that conversation with that person to, because I think it's good to help people make corrections, and then of course when it's egregious, working with our board. But those are the thoughts that I have.
I appreciate that. That's very good points. Who else has some thoughts on that?
I love that. And I'll just add something small. I suspect that many of the people attending today have encountered a trainee before or have acted as a clinical supervisor before. And just, I think that just emphasizes the immense responsibility we have as clinical supervisors and as mentors to include multicultural training and consideration in the training of our students. I wish someone had intervened with the student or stressed more or with the student, with this clinician back in training, or if they were currently training, they're just really hammering home, you can't do that. You can't do that. That's going to cause harm to the client. That is, just exactly what happened. And so just remembering our responsibility that the way we train the next generation is incredibly important around cultural issues, and same with beneficence in that light. So I'll just.
Yeah, thank you. Very good. It kind of reminds me that this is one of those issues, perhaps the therapist thinks they're, bringing up values, their own values. And we've been talking about, what's the balancing act? When is it okay to talk about values that go against the therapist, the client's values? That's a case where that wasn't even an issue of discussions. That seems pretty clear cut. That needs some type of intervention. Other thoughts? Okay, next question. Once I was working with a client of color that regularly indicated their concern that medical providers were not really caring about what happened with their health or the health of their family members. When I attempted to discuss this in light of what I knew of health disparities and bias in primary care, the client became upset with me for giving evidence supporting their own concerns. Would the panel speak to ways that therapists can help clients that may have difficulty with acknowledging this? Great question.
So I guess I'll speak. I do end up, I've had quite a bit of conversations with clients who've shared having experiences with some medical provider or some other provider that was problematic. And I do a lot of our motivational interviewing training, and I do tend to use a motivational interviewing approach in terms of seeking to understand with empathy what that person's is going through, what was their experience like, using a lot of open-ended questions and reflections, and affirming them for the ways that they've handled it, and also helping them to see it within the broader experience of humanity. We do have things that people can do within our system to change providers when they're dissatisfied. And so education about those things that someone can do to self-advocate is shared with individuals. A lot of times though, I'll ask the person, what have they already tried with that person? Have they let that person know how they felt? And many clients will say, no, I have never said anything. I've been meeting with this person for a year, 2 years, 5 years sometimes. And sometimes we have a discussion about, well, what would it be like to let that person know in a very constructive way what your experience has been? How do you think that person would respond? Do you think that it might help them change their behavior? And helping them to realize that they have several options. They can, change providers. They can try to have a discussion with that person if they like to continue working with them. But I think meeting the client where they're at to help them understand, help you understand where they're coming from. And as they're talking about it, the beauty of motivational interviewing is that sometimes as people talk, they hear themselves and they're like, oh, that's what I really meant. And as that process is happening, they may start to realize this is what I really want. So you want that person to take action that's in line with their values, and that really is what they really want. So helping that person by having that conversation.
Other thoughts?
I think we see related issues when we work in trauma, in that sometimes someone comes in with a belief that they're distressed about, and we address that belief, say from a cognitive perspective. It was my fault that this happened. I should have done this and that. And then we work on that, and they go, oh, it's not my fault that it happened. There was nothing I could have done. And then we get a new belief that goes, oh no, now I'm unsafe. There's nothing I can do to protect myself. What do I do? And so I wonder if that acknowledgement, completely without that being your intention, didn't trigger a belief like that for the person of like, oh man, I'm helpless. This happens to everybody, and now what? And not that we have complete control over how clients are going to receive this, but sort of exploring maybe their emotional reaction, where that's coming from. You know, is there a new fear? Is there a helplessness? What does this mean to them if that were true? And then maybe giving them ways to empower them, you know, to either deal with that situation. So one tool I can think of is just like helping them, you know, challenge their thinking, because while that's true, that, you know, people of color are, you know, the target of disparities, not every provider is going to do that to every person of color every time. So how can a client evaluate in a given situation, right? Is this a stuck point? Is this really happening? If this is happening, how can I advocate for myself and be empowered to sort of resolve that? Although, you know, clients also have agency and some responsibility, you know, to be active in part of their treatment too. And sometimes we say something very well in a well-meaning way, and they take it a different way.
Thank you. Other comments?
I love that so much. I just want to be like, yes, ditto to both Maria and Letitia. Just wonderful. I just wanted to add to, I appreciate this question so much. I feel like this person is in my brain, because I've definitely made this mistake before and had a similar experience with a client. I can't speak to really the moment, but I can tell you what I wished I would have done or could have done if I could go back in time. For me, I know that attempting to provide information that validated the client's experience, my motive was to normalize their anxiety. Like, you're not crazy. This really is an issue. That's not in your head, and this is wrong. But I wish I had taken a step further and seen how else I could advocate for the individual beyond just that normalizing. And really, for me, I think a barrier to psychology that I'm just now learning, as much as I love individual therapy, and it's the type of therapy I provided the most, that hyper-individualism is a problem at times. And I think we see therapy with very thick lines around it sometimes, like the room has a very thick wall, and there's stuff that happens in the room, and then there's your limited role outside of it. I know it really depends on the particular race and ethnicity of the client, but some clients of color really benefit from multi-systems therapy and incorporating other systems, advocating in other settings on behalf of the individual with them, along with them, through empowerment. And that can be powerful and continue the positive outcomes in that sense. I wish in hindsight I would have seen if there was other ways I could have helped the client from the position of privilege as the provider. This book has helped me a lot. I meant to add that. Helped me a lot with understanding some of this too. So.
Yeah, thank you. One thing, it wouldn't help with everything because there's so many systemic variables in the healthcare outcomes for people of color. But the recovery-oriented, person-centered movement talks about people learning to be more empowered and be more active and assertive in their interactions with the healthcare providers. And that might be a kind of educational intervention that strikes me might be helpful in some situations. So, okay, let's move to the next one. Here's another one. A few white male clients of mine have discussed that they do not understand why people of color expect the whites to change when they themselves as white males grew up impoverished and were discriminated against as well. Their blindness to privilege as a white male was substantial, and they could not see past this. I did the best I could to discuss privilege, but not much movement was made, and one guy never returned. I feel it's a fine line at times for me between not wanting to run off clients who won't help, but also being anti-racist in the room. Ultimately, I choose to be anti-racist in the therapy room, but it's tough to see clients not return. Comments?
This is such a great point and a very complicated one too that I will attempt to limit my word limit for, and I can certainly relate. I feel like a standard in our education around multiculturalism and white privilege is getting white people to recognize privilege and owning it. And that's a really important step. But sometimes white people also need to understand how this privilege creates costs to them. It sounds like these white male clients don't see how their racism is harming them too, is keeping them isolated, is keeping them afraid, is keeping them inhibited to growth, and ultimately is keeping them out of the therapy room, depending on whether they come back or not. And that I think can sometimes conversations around getting them to acknowledge privilege can be enhanced by helping white clients understand white supremacy a little bit better and the costs of that. I use the smokestack metaphor, or like the building bricks around you. That the most racist clients I've had build walls around everybody and end up being very, very alone, and it makes it very difficult to change their pathologies. That might be one way to kind of expand an approach to introducing racism and anti-racism in the room. It's not just owning privilege, but understanding the full effects of everything.
Any other comments?
This is very similar to issues I've been experiencing lately, or, throughout, but I've been trying to address them more differently lately. And I think that some of the literature, again, that we have is very helpful in this sense. For me, it was very challenging to fix my writing reflex, so to speak, in motivational interviewing, and not want to re-educate the client and get them from A to B in one session, because otherwise I would be remiss and I wouldn't be following principle B to not condone prejudices, And so I think that the advice to, or the guidelines and some of the models to listen and to empathize, it must be really difficult to feel like you also have had, a difficult life, and you maybe don't feel recognized for that. I'm not saying that, you have less power than a person of color, but I'm empathizing with how you're feeling, right? And then I would say exactly what Dr. Jeffrey is talking about, finding ways in which that has had a cost. So, what does that feel like for you when you feel that? And what is it like to hear these news and encounter this? So there's an emotional cost because that person is suffering from this frame of the world. And then, how is there a social cost, like in how you interact with others? And then starting to highlight that sort of like in ACT ways, right? Like, what are the costs? Wow, would it be okay if we could start a conversation? Is this something that if we were to be able to alleviate some of that in therapy for you, would you be interested in that? And once we have that permission, then we have an open door for something that could happen over a course of several sessions, taking into consideration where they are in their racial identity development, and being sensitive to them, and just, moving the needle. And I think sometimes accepting that for some people, what we're going to do is plant seeds and move the needle a little bit, and it is a lifelong process for all of us. So,
yeah, don't underestimate the importance of planting seeds. Absolutely. Okay. Next question. What's one thing, or more than one thing, that you wish more psychologists did related to promoting racial justice?
So I think I have an answer to that. So kind of want to start with a suggestion. I highly suggest people read the 1968 founding statement of the Association of Black Psychology, because I think that's a great example of psychologists, professional psychologists, organizing, banding together, and making demands on the field. And that's what I wish we did. I wish the various groups, whether they're groups of like Black psychologists, gay psychologists, psychologists of different backgrounds, different ethnic groups, psychologists in academia and clinical psychology would band together and make professional demands on the field for how to practice the field more ethically and more justly, and how to change education. Because right now, I'm afraid that professional organizations, at least for academics, have really turned into, we pay our fees, we get our journals, we go once a year, we submit a poster, and boom, I'm in APA or I'm in APS. And every once in a while, I think we need to renew our commitment to seeing psychology as not just a science, but a science that has impact on society. And to do that, we need to rebuild these communities. So think about like the original model of SPSSI, the Society for Psychological Study of Social Issues in the 1930s, the Association for Black Psychology, and we need to, I think, reinvigorate those sub-communities and make demands on the field. And I feel like sometimes we're just passive members of organizations instead of making demands.
Thank you, Eric. I appreciate that. We're running a little close on time, but we've got one other question, and this should be good for another 7 minutes or so. What are colleges and training programs doing to address anti-racism in training, and how are students responding to it?
I'll also talk quickly about undergrad and then I'll leave it to them, because undergrad, not enough. Basically, it's left up to the discretion of the professor, and if the professor doesn't care about covering it, we don't. So.
I guess I'll just speak to, I know that APA affects, the training programs because of APA accreditation. And I know that the APA accreditation process for psychology internships and fellowships has recently, probably always, but recently even more, has really focused a lot on how are we as a field training individuals to really address diversity and the needs of not just, diversity based on ability or sexual orientation, but especially within race. And so as at accreditation visits, APA is really asking programs to make sure that they have a coordinated and long-term plan for providing training, for making sure that their interns, for recruitment, for not just interns, but as well as staff. So programs have to show that they've made a coordinated and long-term plan effort. And, it's one thing for a program to say we couldn't find any interns or staff of color, but they have to show during those site visits that they made actually real efforts and that there's specific things that are being done to really address training. So I think APA is actually helping us with that, because I know in talking to programs or being aware of programs around the country, that programs have made this more of a priority because of that. And so I think that's an important thing. I think most programs tend to have a diversity committee where they're addressing some issues, but I think Dr. DeVivier's presentation earlier just highlights where I think we need to go a little bit more. So, she was describing working with her intern on a case and applying specific, articles to something. So I think that that's probably where we need to go as a field more specifically, is that we better integrate these issues into the work that we do. And a lot of times we just rely on the individual supervisor to do that. And so I think we can do better and move ahead.
Okay. Any other thoughts?
I would just say that one thing that will affect this issue going forward is that there was recently an executive order passed regulating the way that diversity training is done within the government, which does affect things like our internship and our fellowship programs here at the VA. So there are certain things that are being regulated, and we're not going to be allowed to talk about things from, related to critical race theory or white privilege or, anything that makes anyone from any race to feel shame or guilt or anything like that. So it's not really prohibiting diversity training from taking place, but it is sort of dictating the content of what can be addressed and how, there are systems being put in place to sort of monitor that is being complied with. So that is a challenge that we will be facing going forward. And I'm very happy that as a leader of the book club, we are not a training anything. We're just a book club. And so we recently changed our name. We might have to change it again. But we're just a book club and it's voluntary. And come and read what you like and talk about what you like. So there's that.
Dr. DeVivier, I really appreciate you bringing up that point. And it was almost like a moment of mourning with my students when we heard, I think it's called the 1776 Commission or something along those lines. please, yeah, Teen Book Club. It sounds amazing. Dr. Mesidor, you did such a beautiful job too of our RAPA training is very simple. I mean, ours looks just like that in our university. And so that was a great description. There are certain standards that programs have to meet. I know personally, some changes that I've seen in the field is a shift from multicultural counseling and multicultural education to liberation psychology. And I put those in air quotes because I think historically multicultural classes have focused on the other a little too much and the experiences of the oppressed, not how to change the oppressor, not how to stop oppression. And liberation psychology is really gaining a lot of momentum right now in challenging the way our theoretical orientations, even our most evidence-based ones, really do or don't consider cultural considerations very deeply, and how therapy needs to be very client-centered, and how to differentiate or how to use humanistic therapy with the goal of liberation too. And I know that there's a real emphasis on including that multicultural liberation-based component across all classes. So it's in our intelligence assessment classes. It's not just isolated to one class. It's in research design when we talk about the very disturbing eugenics movements and Carl Pearson and the like. And what Dr. Pritchard was sharing with assessments too, how students are getting kind of a, the education, standard of education of training that has been established, but with the caveats, with the gray area, with the new lenses now. It makes me excited for the students of the future who were very discouraged by that same declaration, that commission. So I'm excited to see where it's growing.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, panel. We're about out of time. Let me close with this. Someone typed a response to one of the questions, so I'll read this out for people to consider. It says, I'm by no means an expert, but my initial thought is, what is the most anti-racist approach in the long run? It might be that we have to build enough rapport to keep someone in the room so we have a more long-term opportunity to engage them in those important conversations in the way that they will hear us. Okay. So thanks to everyone. I really appreciate the panel. What a wonderful group, man. This is just, excellent. So thank you for being here, for sharing your information, your wisdom, and your thoughts with us. Thank you, audience. I hope you enjoy the rest of the day. Have a good evening.
All right. Thank you so much, panelists. Thank you, Dr. White, for moderating. This was wonderful information. And I know we've been taking in a lot of information today, you guys. So please know this is going to be on YouTube for us to go back and digest even further as we move along in the different spaces in which we operate. So just a couple of things. I'm going to ask Pat Griffin to come on, if you could turn your video on, and if you could help us out, Eric, with making that in a way where the attendees can see everybody that's on, including myself and Dr. Griffin when she comes on, because she just wants to make a brief announcement. Thank you, Eric. Okay, go ahead, Pat.
Thank you, Dr. Holmes, and I will be brief. I too want to thank this marvelous panel. Thank you very much for bringing this topic to our conference this fall and creating a space where we could address pertinent concerns that we're all faced with during this political climate. I just want to add to the reference list a couple of other resources. One is, and this is related to Dr. Pritchard's presentation on the academic setting, and the title of this book is Even the Rat Was White. And some of you are shaking your heads. You're familiar with this, by Robert Guthrie. He's passed on now, but he was a noted African-American psychologist. This is a must read, especially for those in academia. Two other references, I mentioned one this morning when Dr. Kelly was presenting, and that's Medical Apartheid by Harriet Washington, a medical ethicist that deals with disparities and racism in the medical field. White Too Long is another one that addresses racism in the religious, Christian, evangelical, white Protestant, white Catholic feel, and there is empirical evidence on the racism scale in that book, and that's quite too long. And then finally, a book by one of Arkansas's noted psychologists who recently made his transition, and that is Racism Learned at an Early Age Through Racial Scripting. Racism Learned at an Early Age Through Racial Scripting. And I have several copies of that book. If you're interested in that particular book, just contact me, please. Thank you, Dr. Holmes.
Okay, I was muted. Thank you so much, Dr. Griffin. I appreciate that. Those additional references, and the references will be made available. I think all of the panelists compiled a list of references to make available to those who registered and attended. So that will be, I believe our executive director, Eric DeRay, will get that emailed out to all that registered. So you should receive that via email. So please look out for that. And I believe he will also post it on our website. So even those who didn't attend can still access that, because that would be great information for people to just access. So thank you all again. So this is the conclude to the panel. So if you could please, just a couple of announcements. If you